It was a Halloween night like any other in a quiet neighborhood, where kids were running through the streets, dressed in creative costumes, carrying bags filling up with candy and treats. Among them was Ryan, a clever boy with bright eyes and a mischievous smile. He was famous in the neighborhood for always being the kid who managed to collect the most candy on Halloween. Every year he prepared himself, studying each house that offered the best treats, mapping out a route to ensure his collection would be bigger than any other kid's. That night, Ryan was determined to beat his own record. He bounced from house to house, always ready with a joke and a trick for each resident who opened their door. His bags were so full that he started carrying two, one in each hand, bragging to his friends. "Nobody can get more candy than I can," he said proudly. That's when he heard about Mrs. Marlene. Rumor had it that she lived in a secluded house at the end of the street, away from the usual trick-or-treating routes. She was a reclusive woman that no kids ever approached. Some said she was a witch, others said she didn't even like children. But that Halloween night, something strange was happening. A dim light was on at her porch, as if she was expecting visitors. Ryan, with his usual competitive spirit, was curious. If her light was on, maybe it was his chance to get a special treat, one that no other kid would have. This, he thought, would make his Halloween collection truly unique. Ignoring the spooky stories, he began walking toward Mrs. Marlene's house, already imagining what he might find there. Mrs. Marlene's house was old and seemingly neglected. The windows were dusty, the plants around it were dry and twisted, and the gate creaked loudly as Ryan pushed it open. He hesitated for a moment, feeling a chill run down his spine. But determined to score that last treat, he pressed on. When he reached the door, Ryan took a deep breath and knocked 3 times. The sound echoed in the silence of the night, and he felt a growing anxiety as he waited. The door opened slowly, and on the other side, a thin old woman with white hair appeared. She wore an old dress and had a piercing gaze that seemed to see right through Ryan in a way he had never experienced before. "Good evening, young man," Mrs. Marlene said in a hoarse and calm voice. "You're here for candy, aren't you?" She watched him in a strange way, as if she knew everything about him, and Ryan felt uneasy under her gaze. But, determined, he nodded. The woman disappeared for a few moments and returned holding a single piece of candy, wrapped in old, almost worn-out gold paper. She handed it to Ryan, holding on to it a bit longer than necessary, and whispered, "This candy is special. Don't open it until tomorrow, understand? If you open it now, it will lose its power." Ryan accepted the candy, feeling a mix of curiosity and apprehension. He thanked her, turned around, and began walking back toward the main street. But Mrs. Marlene's instruction kept nagging at his mind. "Why can't I open it now?" he thought, intrigued. As he moved away from the house, he couldn't resist. In a dark alley, lit only by the moon, he unwrapped the golden paper. The candy was a deep red, shiny, almost as if it had its own light. He sniffed it and, without hesitation, took a bite. The taste was irresistible, sweet and sour at the same time, something he had never tasted before. But as he swallowed the first piece, something strange began to happen. A slight dizziness took over him, and his vision started to blur. Suddenly, Ryan began seeing images, but they weren't his own memories. They were strange scenes of children in Halloween costumes, kids he had never seen before. They looked sad, lost, and he felt like he was seeing something terribly wrong. Each image was quick but vivid, as if each child were trying to tell him something, asking for help. The dizziness intensified, and he fell to his knees, clutching his head as the visions continued. With each image, he saw a new face, a child's face that gradually seemed familiar, as if he knew each one of them. One of them, a blonde girl, stared at Ryan with sad, hollow eyes, and he could hear her whispering, "We shouldn't have taken the candy." Desperate, Ryan threw the candy to the ground, trying to regain control. The visions stopped, but he was weak, his body felt heavy. He tried to stand, but his legs were trembling. Something was wrong. He realized he was no longer alone. Behind him, a familiar figure appeared. It was Mrs. Marlene, with the same enigmatic smile as before. "I told you not to open it, Ryan," she said, her tone a mixture of disappointment and satisfaction. "Now you know, the last treat always comes at a price." Ryan tried to argue, to ask for an explanation, but no sound came from his mouth. He felt a force holding him in place, as if he were bound by invisible chains. His eyes filled with tears, and he saw around him small figures appearing, figures of children in Halloween costumes, the same ones he had seen in his visions. Each one looked at him with sadness, with the same hollow, empty eyes he had seen before. He understood then the fate that awaited anyone who took that last treat from Mrs. Marlene. Every child who had fallen for the temptation to open the candy too soon was there, trapped, unable to leave. Mrs. Marlene began to walk away, leaving Ryan surrounded by the ghostly figures of the children. He tried to move, but he couldn't. Each time he tried to take a step, it was as if the weight of the visions held him down even more, as if the candy were now an inseparable part of him. The next morning, Ryan's bags were found dropped in the street, empty. The neighborhood was in an uproar, searching for the boy who loved Halloween and candy so much, but no one found a trace of him. Ryan's story became a legend in the neighborhood, a dark tale about the boy who disappeared on Halloween after visiting Mrs. Marlene's house. And every Halloween, kids would still talk about him, about the golden candy and the warning not to open it too soon. The bags he left behind remained there, untouched, a dark reminder of the last treat that no one should have opened. And deep down, everyone knew that Mrs. Marlene was still there, waiting, with a special treat wrapped in gold for the next child who couldn't resist. Story 2. It was a busy Halloween night, with kids running from house to house, eagerly collecting candy. The neighborhood was filled with laughter and children's voices as residents handed out treats from decorated bowls, while some kids played tricks when they didn't get what they wanted. At every door they knocked on, they got more candy and laughter, and the night seemed to glow with excitement. Among the children was a group of 4 friends: Peter, Julia, Caleb, and Luke. They were inseparable and spent every Halloween together, collecting candy and sharing funny stories about their pranks. Every year, they made bets to see who could get the most unusual or rare candies. It was a tradition among them to look for the most unique treats to make their Halloween collections stand out. That night, as they went from house to house, something caught the group's attention. An old man, whom no one recognized, was walking calmly down the street, watching the children. He carried an old cloth bag, occasionally stopping to offer candy to those who passed by. Peter, always curious and the most daring of the group, noticed that the man's candy looked unique, with bright colors and strange shapes, unlike any others they had seen. "Look guys, he's got some really weird candy," Peter said, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. "I bet no one else has those." The friends looked toward the man and examined the candy. Julia hesitated, feeling wary. "Are they even safe? He looks... I don't know. Kind of strange," she commented, looking skeptical. But Peter, determined to stand out with the rarest candy of the night, ignored Julia's concerns and walked up to the man. "Good evening, sir. Are you giving out candy?" Peter asked, trying to sound polite. The man looked at him with an enigmatic smile and held out the bag, showing the candy. Each piece looked even stranger up close. One was dark blue with silver specks, another was red with a faint golden glow, and there was a green one with a scent Peter had never smelled before. It was as if the candy had a life of its own, and Peter felt instantly fascinated. "These candies are very special," the man said in a low, raspy voice, almost a whisper. "But be careful, they're not for just anyone." Peter laughed, thinking it was just a Halloween trick to scare the kids. He picked a green candy, thanked the man, and returned to the group, proudly showing off his prize. Julia looked at the candy with a mix of curiosity and suspicion, while Caleb and Luke also took some from the man's bag, without paying much attention to his words. "You're lucky," the man said, watching the group. "Not everyone can have these candies." The group continued their walk, but soon noticed something strange. After eating the candy, each of them started feeling odd. At first, it was a slight dizziness, which they ignored, thinking it was just from the excitement of the night. But then Peter began hearing voices, a low and persistent whisper, as if someone were calling his name. "Do you guys hear that?" he asked, stopping suddenly. His friends shook their heads, but soon realized they too were feeling strange. Julia began to feel uncomfortable, as if she were being watched, while Caleb felt a mild headache that seemed to grow. Over time, the sensations intensified. Each of them began seeing and hearing things that weren't there. Julia saw a shadow pass by her side, but when she turned, nothing was there. Caleb felt a chill up his spine, as if an invisible hand were touching him, and Luke saw unfamiliar faces reflected in the windows of the houses. They started looking at each other suspiciously, trying to understand what was happening. Could it be the candy? Julia asked, her eyes wide with fear. These things started happening after we ate it. Peter, still trying to keep his composure, laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. It's just in our heads. It's Halloween. We're just scaring ourselves. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. As the night went on, the visions and sensations became stronger. The group began to hear footsteps following them and whispers coming from different directions, as if an invisible crowd were watching them. Peter decided it was best for them to go home. But they noticed that, no matter which direction they walked, they kept running into the old man, standing at various corners with the same mysterious smile. Gradually, they began to feel a weight on their bodies, an inexplicable exhaustion. It was as if the candies they had eaten were draining their energy, leaving them weaker by the minute. Peter, who had led the group confidently earlier, now walked more slowly, his legs heavy and his breathing labored. As they passed through a nearly deserted park, they saw the man standing there again, silently watching them. Julia, consumed by fear and anger, approached him and yelled, "What did you do to us? What's in those candies?" The man only smiled, his gaze calm and piercing. "I did nothing, my young friends. You chose to accept them. Curiosity always has a price." Caleb, desperate, tried to throw the candy out of his pocket, but he found it seemed to stick to his hand as if it had fused with his skin. Each attempt to get rid of the candy caused intense pain, as though he were tearing part of himself away. The group was terrified, and each one began to question why they had taken the candy from the stranger. Peter, who had led them to take the candies, now felt guilty, fearing that his desire to stand out that night had put his friends in danger. Desperate, they tried to run away, but the man always appeared at the corners, watching them. Finally, he approached the group and calmly said, "You wanted something unique, something special. Now you have something that no one else has, a connection you will never break." Peter tried to argue, begging for help, but the man simply turned his back, leaving them standing in the park. When the man finally disappeared from view, they felt a brief relief. However, the strange sensations persisted, and each of them realized that the visions and whispers had not stopped. That night, each of them went home, feeling that something had changed forever. The visions and whispers continued, appearing more frequently and intensely. The shadows they had seen in the streets began appearing inside their homes, and the whispers, once faint, now sounded like screams in their heads. Isolated and not knowing what to do, each friend spent the following days alone, dealing with the terror of their visions. And each Halloween that passed, the manifestations grew stronger, the whispers became louder, and the presence of the man seemed to follow each of them wherever they went. Peter, Julia, Caleb, and Luke were never the same. And whenever someone asked what they had gotten that Halloween, they only exchanged silent glances, too scared to tell the truth. They knew that each piece of candy held a curse, an invisible mark that tied them to the man, and that night, forever. Story 3. It was Halloween night, and 4 teenagers were roaming the streets with bags full of candy. They were exhausted but determined to keep going until they had as many treats as possible. Among them was Jake, the group's leader, who had a daring idea to end the night. He suggested they go to the last house on the street, an old, isolated house rumored to be haunted. Word around the neighborhood was that the owners handed out expensive, exotic candy, which sounded irresistible to them. "Come on, guys, this is our chance to get the best candy of the night," Jake said, filled with excitement, trying to convince the group to follow him. Emma, a cautious girl and slightly fearful, hesitated. She'd heard stories about that house, tales of people who'd gone there and were never seen again. Even so, curiosity and the influence of her friends persuaded her to go along. "But what if it's dangerous? Everyone says it's haunted," she said, trying to sound cautious. Beside her, Tyler and Lily exchanged glances. Although nervous, the idea of exclusive candy was too tempting. "Just one last stop, Emma. Then we can head home, Tyler reassured her, trying to calm her nerves. With that, the group decided to venture to the last house on the street, an old building with a dark garden full of twisted trees that seemed to come to life under the pale moonlight. The walk to the house was marked by an uncomfortable silence. As they got closer, the sounds of laughter and children's voices faded away, leaving the street increasingly deserted and eerie. A cold wind rustled the dry leaves on the ground, creating a symphony of whispers, while the house loomed ominously before them. When they finally reached the door, they hesitated for a moment. The house was even more frightening up close. Broken windows, peeling paint, and a strange darkness seemed to swallow all the light around it. But Jake, determined not to miss out on the candy, knocked on the door. The sound echoed, and silence soon filled the space once more. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman, thin and pale, who looked at them with a vacant, fixed gaze. She wore an old, faded dress and spoke in a low, raspy voice. "Trick or treat?" she asked, smiling slightly as if she had been expecting them. "Treats, of course," Jake said, trying to sound confident. The old woman stepped back, motioning for them to come inside. The four exchanged glances, reluctant, but Jake encouraged them to follow. "Come on, guys, we'll just grab the candy and go. It'll be quick," he said, gently nudging Emma forward. And so they entered the house, and the door closed silently behind them. Inside, the atmosphere was cold and dark. The walls were lined with old portraits, and the air smelled strange, a mix of dust and something faintly sweet, reminiscent of burnt caramel. The woman guided them down a narrow hallway to a room where a large bowl of candy sat in the center of an old wooden table. "Here are the treats," she said, with a mysterious smile. "But you must make a choice. Only one piece per person, nothing more." Jake, his eyes fixed on the bowl, couldn't resist and was the first to pick a piece of candy. He chose a caramel wrapped in gold foil. Emma hesitated, but, pressured by her friends, picked a dark chocolate treat. Tyler and Lily took colorful candies, eyeing the woman suspiciously as she continued to watch each of them with an intriguing expression. As soon as they had their candy, the woman looked at them and, in a softer voice, said, "Each piece carries a secret and a debt. You will understand its meaning, but only when you are ready." The friends laughed, thinking it was just another Halloween act meant to scare kids. They quickly thanked her and left the house, feeling a slight relief as they stepped back into the fresh night air. But as they walked away, each began to feel something strange. Emma noticed it first, experiencing sudden dizziness and glancing at the candy in her hand. It seemed to be pulsating, as if it had a life of its own. Tyler, who had been laughing and making jokes, suddenly began hearing faint laughter that seemed to come from inside his head. He looked around, but no one was there besides his friends. The sound grew louder, turning into a voice calling his name. "Tyler, Tyler." He grew uneasy, glancing around nervously. Jake, who had been confident until then, felt a sense of regret, a foreboding that something terrible was about to happen. With every step he took, he felt the weight of the caramel in his pocket, as though it were getting heavier. Lily, meanwhile, felt an intense chill, as if the temperature around her was dropping rapidly. As they continued to walk, they realized that no matter which way they went, they kept ending up in front of the old woman's house. It was as if they were trapped in a loop, where every direction led back to the dark house and its eerie garden. Desperation began to settle in. Gradually, they understood they would have to face what the candy represented. Jake was the first to unwrap his caramel, trying to figure out what was happening. Inside the wrapper, he found a small message. "The leader pays with the first fear." As soon as he read it, Jake was flooded with visions of his worst fears. He saw himself alone, abandoned by his friends, in a dark and freezing place where a faceless figure slowly approached. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. When he returned to reality, he was trembling, and his friends looked at him in horror. Emma opened her candy, finding an equally disturbing message. "Caution is lost at the moment of decision." She felt her body freeze, unable to move, as if she were bound by invisible chains. Terror consumed her, and she began to cry, realizing that, like Jake, she was facing her deepest fear. Tyler and Lily hesitated, but they knew they had no choice. When they unwrapped their candy, they found similar messages, forcing them to confront their darkest fears. Tyler, who always hid behind humor, found himself in a place where no one laughed, where he was surrounded by loneliness. Meanwhile, Lily faced total isolation, as though she were the last person on Earth. After each of them endured their experience, they felt a lightness, as if part of the weight had lifted. They looked around and saw they were finally out of the garden. They found themselves back on the street, dazed and exhausted, feeling as if something had changed forever. The next morning, they met up to talk about what they had been through, realizing that each had carried a personal burden, and that visiting that house had forced them to confront something deep within themselves. The experience had brought them closer in an inexplicable way, but left them with a lasting fear. They never returned to that house, and in the years that followed, they avoided it every Halloween. They knew they had been changed by that night, and the taste of the candy remained in their memories as a dark reminder that some secrets must be faced but never explored again.